Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Calvin Farrow moved to a quiet corner of Alabama to escape his past, he never expected the real danger would come from his neighbor, a power-hungry HOA president with secrets buried deeper than missing mail. What began as a hunch soon unraveled a web of surveillance, control, and silent fear. When I first moved to the outskirts of Mobile, Alabama, I told myself I'd finally earned the right to disappear. After 20 years in the Department of Homeland Security, I wanted nothing more than a quiet corner of the world where I could listen to the cicadas and not worry about whether the next knock on the door was another investigation. The house I bought had history, an old judge's estate at the end of a dead-end road, wrapped in oak trees and Spanish moss. It had its own drive, its own mailbox, and, most importantly, it stood outside the reach of the local homeowners association. Or so I thought. My nearest neighbors were a cluster of identical beige houses on the other side of the cul-de-sac, part of a development called Maple Circle Estates. They lived by the gospel of their HOA president, Greg Langston, a man who, from what I'd heard, ran the place like a private prison block. I had no interest in their rules, and legally they had no power over me. That separation felt like freedom until my mailbox started going suspiciously empty. The first time I noticed, it was tax season. I was waiting on some IRS forms and a DMV registration renewal. A week passed, then two. When I checked online, the tracking information said the letters had been successfully delivered. I stood at the end of my driveway, staring at the empty mailbox, wondering if I was losing my touch. After years of reading threat assessments and spotting inconsistencies for a living, I didn't like coincidences. I called the local post office, spent half an hour in automated purgatory, and finally reached a tired clerk who assured me that everything was scanned as delivered. She promised to open a case. I knew what that meant. It would vanish into bureaucracy faster than my missing mail. Then more things started disappearing. A friend from D.C. mailed me a handwritten note. I never got it. My bank sent a new debit card. Gone. At first, I blamed the Postal Service, but after one particular weekend, the pattern got too sharp to ignore. My security system, a network of 4 cameras linked to an encrypted server, showed 2 nights of blackout. Power was fine, internet stable, but the feed to the mailbox gate was dead from midnight to dawn, precisely the window when the tracked mail had supposedly arrived. Someone had cut the camera signal or jammed it. Either way, it wasn't random. I mentioned it to one of my old contacts from DHS, a friend now working with the Mobile Police Department. He ran the tracking numbers for me through internal USPS systems. Every one of them showed delivered direct drop to customer box. That was enough to tell me the mail wasn't getting lost in transit. It was reaching my property and then vanishing. That narrowed it down to one possibility. Someone was taking it from the box. I walked the perimeter of my driveway the next morning, boots crunching on the gravel, and noticed something I'd missed before. Faint tire impressions near the roadside, fresh enough the dew still clung to them. They stopped right beside the mailbox post and turned back toward the street. I crouched, brushed the dirt with my thumb, and felt the familiar, cold tightening in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was the instinct of a man who's about to find the pattern in the noise. I checked my mailbox for tampering. The lock wasn't forced, but the metal flap had tiny scratches around the keyhole, not made by a screwdriver, by a key that didn't quite fit. That detail changed everything. Whoever it was, they weren't just snooping. They had access. Maybe a master key from an old postal lock set, or maybe they'd had one copied. Either way, it wasn't a kid playing games. That evening, as the sky turned that swampy orange over the trees, I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee and watched the street. Across the cul-de-sac, the HOA patrol truck did its slow ritual crawl, a white Ford Explorer with the association's logo on the door. Behind the wheel was Greg Langston himself, ex-corrections officer turned self-appointed neighborhood warden. He'd been circling every night lately, headlights off until the last second, the way men do when they're used to sneaking up on people. Our eyes met once when he drove past, and he gave me a little salute, the kind that says, "I'm watching." I gave him nothing back. Still, when I went to bed, I locked every door, checked every feed twice, and left a note on my desk. If I'm right, this isn't the post office's fault. In my line of work, I'd learned that patterns reveal intent. And the pattern at Maple Circle Estates was starting to look a lot like surveillance. I spent the next morning making some very specific upgrades. My usual security setup was already above average, habit from my former life, but now I needed it surgical. I didn't want a general feed, I wanted undeniable evidence. So I drove down to a specialty electronics supplier I knew on the outskirts of town and picked up a miniature motion-activated camera with thermal and low-light capacity, the size of a thumb drive, black as oil, built to sit still and invisible for days. I also picked up a pair of micro SD cards, an independent power cell, and a camouflaged housing shaped like a stone eagle, the kind of tacky Americana people plant on mail posts for decoration. By sundown, I had the thing installed on top of my mailbox pillar, angled perfectly downward. From 5 feet away, it just looked like an ugly old bird statue. Inside, it was recording on infrared and dumping footage to a micro drive every time someone got within 3 feet of the box. It had its own battery, own memory, and wasn't tied to my house's Wi-Fi, which meant no signal to jam. It was the kind of setup that gets people fired when they don't know it's watching. For 2 days, nothing happened. My mail arrived as expected. A magazine, some junk coupons, 1 voter notice. I didn't touch anything. I wanted to build the trap without springing it too early. Then, on the 3rd morning, I woke up before dawn and checked the eagle. The indicator light blinked green. There was something on the card. Back in my office, I inserted the drive into my desktop and opened the file. I didn't expect much. But at exactly 5:47 a.m., the eagle caught him. The motion blur was faint, but then the thermal signature came into focus. A man in a dark green security uniform approached my box, looked over his shoulder once, then pulled a key from his belt. It fit smoothly into the lock. He opened the hatch like it was his own. He took out a stack of mail, 5, maybe 6 envelopes, and started thumbing through them. One by one, he photographed the contents with a small flashlight camera clipped to his chest. Then he pulled out 2 letters, folded them under his arm, and placed the rest back inside. As he turned, the lens caught his face fully in profile. Square jaw, balding, mustache. I froze the frame, zoomed in, and grinned without humor. Greg Langston. He wore a security badge labeled Maple Circle Patrol. His old correction-style boots crunched in the gravel as he moved, careful, silent, efficient, like someone who'd done it before. The timestamp, the thermal match, the fact that the mail reappeared minus 2 pieces. It was all there. Not just theft, not just trespass. This was a federal felony, obstruction, and tampering with U.S. mail. I backed up the file to 3 separate hard drives and wrote a brief incident summary, time-stamped and notarized by one of those mobile notary services I'd used for years. When you work cases involving internal abuse of power, you learn to never present just one copy of evidence. I had backups, paper logs, time sinks, metadata, all the things a DA's office loves, but I wasn't about to hand it over just yet. I knew how men like Greg operated. He wasn't acting out of impulse. He thought he had license. The kind that grows from years of people looking away. No one in Maple Circle had stopped him before, which meant I was likely not the only one missing mail. I needed to be sure. That evening, I walked the neighborhood. I took the long way around, dressed like any other jogger, nodding at folks watering their lawns. I stopped to talk to a young couple unloading groceries and casually asked if their mail had been reliable. The woman frowned. Now that you mention it, Chase mailed us new cards last week. Said they were delivered, but we haven't seen them. Her husband shrugged. Figured it was a USPS thing. You too? I nodded, non-committal. Just a few missing things. Probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I spoke to 3 more families in the next 20 minutes. An older widow named Marjorie who hadn't received her prescription refill notice, a man named Desmond who said his Verizon statement had gone missing, and a nervous teenager whose college admission letter still hadn't arrived. That was 5 people. 5 chances Greg had taken, confident no one would link it together. When I got back to my office, I wrote their names down and connected the timelines. They matched, all delivered within the last 10 days, all vanished after dark or in the early morning. I pulled up the HOA's website and stared at Greg's profile photo for a long time. He was standing with folded arms, an American flag in the background, his name etched under the words order, safety, community. It was almost poetic, in a way. The man once in charge of prisoners had become the warden of a suburban illusion, and no one had the guts to call him on it. Until now. I composed an encrypted email to the Postal Inspection Service. I didn't attach the video yet, just a brief, formal inquiry about how to report suspected mail interference with corroborating footage. I wanted them primed, but not warned. When I moved, I wanted it to hit all at once. As the sky darkened again over Maple Circle Estates, I sat at my desk, sipped cold coffee, and watched the playback one more time. Greg's face flickered in the thermal wash. Calm, efficient, confident. I whispered to the screen, "Gotcha." The next morning, I went to work like I was building a case for a federal indictment, because technically, I was. I dusted off my old habits, the ones I'd tried to retire with my badge, cross-referencing data points, tracing behavioral patterns, watching for the little tells that pointed toward systemic abuse. Greg Langston wasn't just nosy, he was organized, he was deliberate, and I had a hunch this wasn't the first time he dipped into other people's mailboxes under the pretense of community safety. I started with property records. Alabama's public databases were clunky, but I knew how to navigate them. I pulled down a list of Maple Circle Estates parcels and ran searches against civil complaints and HOA enforcement letters. It didn't take long to notice something odd. Over the last 8 months, the HOA had sent out 32 official violation notices, citing undeclared improvements or unauthorized modifications. That might sound normal until you realize nearly all of them targeted people who had either refinanced their homes or pulled permits for minor work. In other words, people whose mail likely included financial paperwork or contractor notices, letters someone like Greg could have seen and flagged without permission. That wasn't just creepy, that was calculated. I picked a few addresses at random and walked the neighborhood again, posing as a curious new resident, thinking about buying a place nearby. One woman, a school counselor, told me she'd gotten a fine for repainting her porch, even though the color hadn't changed. Another man got a $300 violation notice after installing a mailbox planter, even though 3 other houses had the same one. When I gently asked how the HOA knew about the work, he said, "Beats me. I never filed anything." It became clear Greg had been weaponizing information, using mail to anticipate changes, then slapping people with fines or threatening inspections before they even reported anything. The HOA covenants were vague enough to allow it, a catch-all clause about aesthetic harmony and community compliance. But the method? That crossed a line. That night, I combed through the HOA's newsletters. Buried in a January issue was an announcement that Maple Circle has partnered with a new property compliance monitoring service to ensure a safer, more orderly community. No name listed, no contact info, just a friendly reminder that your mail may contain clues that you're due for an update. Clues. Jesus. I wasn't dealing with a micromanaging HOA board. I was staring at the spreadsheeted paranoia of a man who had transformed an entire neighborhood into a controlled environment where your mailbox wasn't just private property, but a surveillance point. I decided to test a theory. The next morning, I crafted a decoy. I took an old envelope and marked it "Estimate Enclosed, Solar Panel Install," addressed to myself from a fake company. Inside, I included a printout with fake numbers, $17,200 system estimate, battery bank options, and some phony contractor contact info. Then I dropped it into my own mailbox. The next 24 hours passed quietly. The morning after that, I checked the Eagle Cam. 5:48 a.m. Greg again. Same routine. Open, scan, photograph, remove. Except this time, he put the letter back in full. But when I examined the envelope, I could see it had been opened with a razor. The bottom edge was neatly sliced and resealed with a glue stick. It was subtle, professional, something you'd miss unless you'd planted it yourself. The bait had worked, but I wanted more than a gotcha video. I wanted the kind of evidence that made prosecutors salivate. So I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years, Jessica Raines, investigative journalist for the Mobile Ledger. Back in my DHS days, she'd helped break a story about contractor corruption at a port facility. She was smart, careful, and most importantly, fearless. I sent her an encrypted message with just 4 words, "Langston, mailboxes. I have proof." She replied within 2 hours. We met at a gas station parking lot halfway to Bayou La Barre, neutral ground. I brought printouts, stills, a burner flash drive with raw footage, and a typed timeline of events. She brought a small digital recorder and a battered legal pad. I walked her through the pattern, the neighbors, the violations, The tracking data, when I showed her the video of Greg at the mailbox, her eyebrows climbed. "You sure that's Langston?" she asked. "Thermal confirms height, gait, body frame. Face match is 95% under enhancement. I've seen men go down for less." Jessica nodded, scribbling. "This is big. You know it's not just HOA code. That's federal, mail tampering, unauthorized surveillance, maybe even wire fraud depending on how he's using the data." "He's building profiles," I said. "I think he's sharing information with a third-party contractor, maybe even reselling it. That's why I need a public hook. If I go to the police, it dies in paperwork. But if you give the story oxygen first, we force movement." She nodded again, slower this time. "I'll start digging, but you need to be careful. HOA boards aren't known for playing fair, especially not ones run by men with old prison guard instincts." "Let him come," I muttered. As I left the meeting, I spotted a white Ford Explorer parked across the street, tinted windows, engine running. It pulled away as I approached, no plates on the back. Langston was watching me now. Good. Let him know the game was on. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night in the community center that doubled as a church basement on Sundays. I'd never set foot inside before. The place was small but spotless, with framed photos of landscaping contests and flag-raising ceremonies lining the walls. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a table with a plastic tablecloth stood up front like a courtroom bench. The smell of burnt coffee hung in the air. I took a seat near the back, my folder tucked under my arm, pretending to read the printed agenda that said Community Integrity and Safety Forum. If irony had a perfume, this room reeked of it. By 7 o'clock, most of the residents had arrived. Young couples in polo shirts, retirees in pastel sweaters, and a few tired-looking parents trying to keep kids quiet. Then Greg Langston appeared, wearing his trademark uniform, dark green shirt with Maple Circle Estate security stitched across the chest, tucked into tactical pants. He moved with the self-importance of a man who thought he was the sheriff of suburbia. When he smiled, people smiled back, out of obligation, not warmth. That was power, the kind that thrives on quiet fear. He rapped his knuckles on the table. "Let's keep it civil tonight, folks. A lot of rumors going around. I intend to clear the air." His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on me, they paused for half a second longer than polite. Then he smiled, the slow, knowing kind. Perfect. The first half hour was a theater of bureaucracy. Fence height complaints, someone's mailbox color, a long debate about which trash bins were community standard. I waited, biding my time until the floor opened for public comment. I stood up, calm, voice steady. "Calvin Farrow, County Road 17. I'm not a member of Maple Circle Estates, but my property borders yours, and I think there's a misunderstanding that affects all of us." Langston leaned forward. "You're not on the member list, Mr. Farrow. This form is for residents." I held up a printed photo, a still frame from the Eagle Cam. "Then consider this a courtesy report. Someone has been opening private mailboxes in the area, including mine. I have footage." I walked up, placed the photo on the table, and stepped back. The room murmured. A few people craned their necks to see. Greg's jaw tightened just a bit. He glanced at the photo, then looked up, smiling again, but his voice had lost its warmth. "This is ridiculous. Photoshop. Anyone can fake a picture these days." "Maybe," I said, "but the timestamp matches the delivery records. And your uniform's a hell of a coincidence." Gasps from the crowd. An older woman in the front row whispered something to her husband. A man in the back said quietly, "Wait, we lost mail too." The buzz grew. Greg raised both hands. "Enough. Everyone calm down. I see what's happening here. Mr. Farrow's twisting a situation he doesn't understand." He turned to the audience. "Yes, I checked his mailbox. Yes, I reviewed a few suspicious packages. I did it because I had multiple reports about potentially illegal materials being delivered. Strange shipments, no return addresses. I was protecting you." The room froze. He said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. A hero defending the village from imaginary threats. Someone asked, "You have the right to open mail now?" Greg's voice dropped into that authoritative register honed from years of barking orders. "When community safety's at stake, I have a duty. Homeland Security failed to stop a lot of threats in this country. I won't let Maple Circle be next." The irony nearly made me laugh. "You do realize," I said slowly, "that opening someone else's mail is a federal crime?" You're not a law enforcement officer. You're a volunteer running a neighborhood association." His eyes narrowed. "If you're not with this community, you're a potential risk. And, from what I've seen, you fit the profile of someone hiding something." A few gasps again. One man muttered, "Jesus, Greg." Another woman stood up and said, "That's over the line." The calm suburban facade was cracking. Greg leaned forward, knuckles white. "Mr. Farrow, you come here with your accusations and fake photos, but I've got reports, credible reports, that you've been recording residents without consent. Cameras pointed toward Maple Circle properties. That's invasion of privacy." I met his stare. "My cameras are on my land. Unlike you, I don't trespass to gather evidence." For a moment, silence stretched between us like a live wire. Then Greg smirked, turned to the crowd, and tried to regain control. "You see, folks, this is exactly what I mean. Outsiders creating drama, turning neighbors against each other. Don't let one bitter man ruin what we've built." But the spell had broken. The room wasn't nodding along anymore. People were whispering, exchanging looks. I saw fear, confusion, and something else. Suspicion, not of me, but of him. I didn't press further. The goal wasn't to argue him into submission, it was to plant the seed. Publicly. Let him talk himself into the hole he'd been digging quietly for years. And he did, beautifully. When the meeting ended, he brushed past me at the door, his breath hot with coffee and rage. "You think you're clever, Farrow," he hissed. "You've got no idea how deep this goes. You just picked a fight with the wrong man." I smiled without warmth. "You said it yourself, Greg. If I'm not with you, I must be a risk." His face tightened. He left without another word. Outside, the parking lot lights cast long shadows. I could hear people murmuring as they walked to their cars. The quiet kind of talking that means something broke tonight. The illusion of order, the belief that their warden was keeping them safe. I didn't need them to believe me yet. I just needed them to start doubting him. And from the look in Greg Langston's eyes when he slammed his truck door, I knew he was about to make a mistake. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of gravel crunching. Through the blinds, I saw a beige SUV idling outside my gate. No markings, just dark-tinted windows and a dash-mounted strobe light doing a lazy pulse. A man in a neon vest stepped out and took a photo of my mailbox. Then another. He held a clipboard, muttered something into a walkie, and drove off without ringing the bell. That was my welcome to the next phase. Before I'd even finished my coffee, my phone buzzed. It was Rhonda, a neighbor I barely knew, but we'd nodded at each other across the hedge line a few times. She sounded shaken. "Hey, Calvin. Weird question. Did you get a notice from the HOA about your non-compliant structures?" I hadn't, but Rhonda had. So had two other residents she'd spoken with this morning. All of them had recently gotten deliveries, patio furniture, garden sheds, even a chicken coop permit. And now, magically, they were all being fined for unauthorized installations. HOA letters, citations, photos attached, even though none of them had applied for inspections. "I think," Rhonda said slowly, "they're using our mail to track what we buy." I stared out at my mailbox and let that land. She wasn't wrong. I told her to scan the letter and email it to me. While waiting, I reviewed my camera footage. I'd replaced the Eagle Cam with a new thermal model, one that operated on a frequency even Greg's little signal jammer couldn't touch. Around 4 a.m., just like clockwork, someone had parked a golf cart just past the HOA border, crept up the slope along my cedar fence, and aimed a long lens right at my front porch. They didn't cross the line, not physically, but the intent was clear: surveillance. The email from Rhonda arrived. Her citation included a photo of a backyard bench still in its shipping plastic. It had been taken before the box was even opened. Below that was a demand for a $250 compliance fee and an invitation to schedule a courtesy site inspection with an HOA-approved contractor. I'd seen extortion before, in gangs, in corrupt agencies, even in some sketchy DEA task forces I'd investigated back in my old job. But this was something else. This was a civilian dictatorship masquerading as lawn care. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging. County records, USPS protocols, HOA bylaws. Even though I wasn't subject to them, I needed to know their limits. I called an old contact in the Postal Inspection Service, gave them the camera footage, and dropped a few legal keywords. Title 18, Section 1708, tampering, theft, pattern behavior. That got their attention. By evening, I had two more neighbors reach out. One, a retired teacher named Mr. Dorsey, who discovered someone had accessed his Home Depot account and matched it against his HOA fines. The other, a young mom named Leah, whose baby formula shipment had disappeared last week. Her husband had installed a Ring camera and caught someone photographing the barcode on a FedEx box. Different addresses, same tactic. The pattern was unmistakable now. Greg wasn't just peeking at mail, he was harvesting data, order information, billing names, delivery frequencies, and feeding it into some internal HOA enforcement system, probably through that contractor service they always recommended. It wasn't just surveillance, it was profiling. I knew what I had to do next. That night, I called in a favor from an old friend at the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, Curtis Ramos. We'd crossed paths years ago during a prison audit case. Curtis didn't like HOA nonsense to begin with. "Langston," he said after I gave him the name. "You mean the guy who used to run Riverwatch Corrections? That guy's nuts. He used to put security cameras inside employee lockers, said it was to monitor morale." Perfect. I sent him the folder, videos, letters, timestamps, photos, neighbor statements. Curtis didn't make promises, but he said he'd elevate it to a federal contact once internal review confirmed the data trail. But listen, he added, if he's got a jammer and a camera network, he might have something more serious going on. Don't poke too hard without backup. I hung up and stared out of the window. My mailbox looked innocent again. Clean. Empty. But I could feel the paranoia crawling in. Not mine. His. Greg was slipping. He was trying to drown any dissent in noise. Fake fines, ghost inspections, intimidation by paperwork. But the more he reached, the more people noticed. He'd forgotten the most basic rule of surveillance. When people realize they're being watched, they start watching back. By the following week, the neighborhood was starting to buzz, but not in the usual HOA-approved way. There was tension in the air, like a thunderstorm creeping in behind perfectly trimmed hedges and pastel garden flags. People who used to wave at each other across driveways now shared quiet glances, whispered across fences, huddled over mailboxes. Something had cracked. Curtis from ABI got back to me. He'd fast-tracked my submission up the chain and connected it with two unrelated reports out of northern Alabama. One from a small town where an HOA president had used a community security contractor to photograph residents' deliveries, and another where private mail had been intercepted under the guise of fraud prevention. Neither case had gone to trial yet, but the feds were watching. "Langston fits the profile," Curtis said. "He's not just breaking HOA rules, he's manufacturing a shadow enforcement system." That was all I needed. I started knocking on doors. Some were hesitant, but once I showed the photos, Greg in uniform, his gloved hand buried elbow deep in my mailbox, the dam broke. A dozen neighbors confessed they'd lost mail. A few said their Ring cameras had mysteriously gone offline around 4 or 5 in the morning. Always the same window. One even showed me video of a man holding up a flat RF blocker in front of their smart doorbell, blocking it for just long enough to snap pictures of Amazon boxes before disappearing into the fog. I recorded statements, scanned letters, compiled timestamps. This wasn't just harassment, this was coordinated data collection with weaponized bureaucracy. Greg didn't take it lying down. 3 days later, I received a certified envelope marked Urgent, Community Compliance Notification. No return address, just the HOA's logo in the corner. Inside were 5 glossy photographs of my backyard, my grill, my rainwater tank, even the solar panels on the detached garage, each labeled with notes like non-permitted structure or violation of stormwater drainage code. Along with it came a fine sheet. Total owed, $1,475. Deadline, 14 days. The best part? My property wasn't even in their jurisdiction. He was baiting me, trying to provoke a public meltdown, paint me as unstable. The classic playbook. But I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I sent a cease and desist letter through my lawyer, along with copies of the deed, maps, and a formal notice of non-membership. We mailed it certified and posted it at the edge of my driveway, laminated and zip-tied to a stake. I also printed "You are now trespassing on private property" signs and put them by the mailbox, the gate, and the tree line, all with references to Title 18 federal mail statutes and criminal trespass codes. No more gray zones. Then I went further. I wired a motion sensor to my trail cam system and linked it to a live upload server. I installed license plate readers at both ends of my driveway. I reached out to the Postal Inspection Service again and was told a federal warrant was under review. They were close. The moment they had it, Greg's little empire would start to unravel. And like clockwork, he made the next move. That weekend, during what should have been a sleepy Sunday morning, a so-called contractor, clipboard, polo shirt, no ID, showed up at my gate claiming to be sent by the HOA to verify recent complaints. I didn't even answer. I just stood behind the front window, holding my phone in one hand and a GoPro in the other. When he noticed the lens pointed his way, he backed off and retreated to his pickup, where, surprise, Greg himself was sitting in the passenger seat, sunglasses on, arms crossed. He didn't look at me. Didn't have to. This was a message. But I had a response of my own. That same night, I handed off my full compiled dossier, nearly 50 pages of logs, images, signed neighbor statements, and cam footage, to the local media contact I trusted, Jason Hollingsworth, a reporter at WSFA 12 News, someone who still believed in old-school journalism. I told him, I'm not the only victim, but I might be the loudest. The piece aired the following Monday. Title, HOA President Accused of Federal Mail Tampering and Unauthorized Surveillance in Maple Circle Estates. Footage rolled. My camera caught Greg's face in perfect thermal resolution. They blurred some of the mail, but not the gloves, not the badge, not the timestamps. That night, the HOA forum went into meltdown. I know, because one of the board members sent me screenshots. Greg tried to claim deep fakes, claimed it was a smear campaign, then pivoted to say it was all a pilot security program authorized in an internal vote, one that no one could find minutes for. The sheriff's department issued a statement that same night. An investigation was underway in cooperation with federal authorities. The next day, Greg's truck didn't leave his driveway. But I wasn't done. 2 days later, the knock came. Not on my door, on Greg Langston's. At exactly 6:43 a.m., 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into Maple Circle Estates, slow and deliberate like sharks gliding into a crowded cove. The neighbors noticed. Hell, they gathered, some in robes and coffee mugs, others in gym clothes pretending they weren't watching. But they were. Everyone was. Even the lawn guys cut their blowers and leaned on their rakes. 4 federal agents emerged, Postal Inspection Service jackets zipped, warrant folders in hand. A sheriff's cruiser rolled in behind them. I stood at the edge of my driveway with a thermos in one hand and a field camera in the other. I didn't film, not directly. That felt cheap. But I watched. Because I earned that. Greg opened the door after the third knock. He was in sweatpants and a tucked-in polo, still trying to look like he was in control. For half a second, he tried to speak, gestured toward his ID badge hanging on the foyer wall. One of the agents calmly handed him the warrant. He read it, jaw clenched. Then he turned and motioned them in like he was hosting brunch. You could almost smell the denial radiating off him like cheap cologne. They spent hours inside. I didn't have to wonder what they were looking for. I already knew. And by the time they brought out the banker boxes, I could practically see the contents. Other people's mail, copied driver's licenses, lists of parcel deliveries, maybe even audio logs if the rumors were true. One agent came out carrying a shortwave radio transceiver and a directional antenna array, the kind hobbyists use to eavesdrop or jam weak signals. Illegal? If used for interference, very. By 10:30, Greg Langston was escorted to the cruiser in handcuffs. He didn't speak, didn't yell, just looked over the gathering of neighbors like they were strangers in his dream, as if all of this couldn't possibly be happening. But it was. And I wasn't the one who called the press that time. They came on their own. WSFA, local ABC, even a guy from Mobile Press Register. By noon, the headline read, HOA President Arrested in Widespread Mail Theft, Unauthorized Surveillance Case. The news truck parked at the end of the cul-de-sac didn't move until sundown. That evening, I received 5 different texts from neighbors thanking me, some sheepish, some relieved. One woman, Carla, told me her sister's loan application had mysteriously been denied last month. Another neighbor said he'd gotten a warning for landscaping violations for a fence he'd never built. The kicker? The HOA forum went down, offline entirely. Whether it was sabotage or someone pulling the plug internally, no one knew, but the silence felt like something breaking. 3 days later, I received a certified letter, this one ironically from the HOA board, signed by the vice president. It read, "Due to recent events and a vote of no confidence, Greg Langston has been suspended from all HOA duties pending legal proceedings. A special meeting will be held to discuss further action." Further action. Yeah, I had a few ideas. First, I went to the county records office, dug deeper into Maple Circle's formation documents, their bylaws, their enforcement mechanisms. I found some nasty things. One clause even allowed board members to access shared-use communication infrastructure, which Greg had abused to monitor private security cams and ring networks. It was buried in a rider from 2005 and hadn't been challenged since. I wrote a formal motion to dissolve the HOA entirely, attached an addendum listing over 30 alleged violations of federal and state law under Greg's leadership. I mailed it to every homeowner with copies of the evidence file redacted for privacy. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about setting fire to the system he built. Meanwhile, the DA announced charges: multiple counts of mail theft, wire fraud, illegal surveillance, unauthorized use of personal data, and obstruction. Federal charges were stacked on top. Bail was denied. But Greg had one last move. A week later, I found a package at my door. No return address. Inside, a single envelope. Inside the envelope, a photograph, a black and white printout. Me standing at my mailbox weeks ago, looking over my shoulder, unaware of the camera. It was taken from a high angle, tree-mounted maybe. On the back, in red ink, 4 words: "You were always watched." No signature. I filed it with the evidence and handed it to the authorities. But deep down, I knew what it meant. Greg hadn't just built an HOA. He'd built a cult of control, and there were still members willing to serve him, even now. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon, and this time, they didn't even bother reserving the clubhouse. It was held in a neighbor's driveway, folding chairs arranged in an awkward semicircle like a support group for the legally disillusioned. People looked tired, embarrassed even. No more polished speeches or smug greetings. Just a stack of printed ballots and a shaky voice reading out the motion to dissolve. When the votes were counted, it wasn't even close. 24 in favor, 2 abstained, 0 against. Just like that, Maple Circle Estates HOA was no more. The bylaws, the enforcement fees, the ridiculous architectural review board, gone. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I took down the last remaining HOA notice pinned to a public bulletin board and burned it in my backyard fire pit. No fanfare, just ash and silence. Weeks passed. Greg Langston's trial date was set for early spring. He pled not guilty to everything, naturally. But the mountain of evidence, from the intercepted mail to the surveillance gear to the testimony of over a dozen residents, wasn't going anywhere. His lawyer tried spinning it as overzealous community protection, but no one bought it. I received a letter from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, a formal thank you, and notice of pending restitution. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd be compensated. Several neighbors had joined a civil case, class action. I didn't join it. I had my closure the day I installed the new mailbox. Steel reinforced with a tamper-proof drop slot and a custom plaque that read, "Private property. Tampering is a federal crime. Just ask Greg." Some folks smile when they walk past it. Others look away. I don't need a fence. That box says everything.